Chapter 2. The Mark of the Suri. Plague handed her another glass of water. Nasky sipped it quietly, looking at him. He was a thin guy, but by the fact that he had carried her all the way to a private clinic that was 4 blocks away, she knew he was strong. He still made her nervous, though. It wasn't his hair which hung in his face and brushed his shoulders. It wasn't the frown on his face or the way he watched her as she drank. It was the fact that he had no left eye. There wasn't even a hole where it should have been, simply an indent in his head, under his eyebrow. He didn't seem to notice that it bothered her. His other eye was a deep golden color and was perfectly fine the way it was, but Nasky couldn't stop staring back at him where his left eye should have been. "Did you see who hurt you?" Plague asked her. "Just for a second," Nasky replied. "Could you tell me what he looked like?" Are you a cop?" "No." Plague's lips pulled up slightly into an amused smile. Nasky fell silent, looking at him. He wore a white t-shirt and black jeans, his hands shoved in his pockets. His slight smile had given way to a bored frown. "Do you remember what he looked like?" Plague asked finally. "Well, yes, but I'm not a cop." Nasky looked back down. "I may not be a cop, but I'll find the guy that hurt you much faster than a cop would." Plague's voice was utterly serious. "I can't explain his face," Nasky told him, "but he had blonde hair and really green eyes." Plague racked his memory. Did he know any diseases that had blonde hair and green eyes? "He also said something," Nasky frowned. "Something like, 'Long live the Zalturo' or something." "Zalturi," Plague corrected her. "Yes, that was it." She looked at him. "How do you know the word?" Plague hesitated. The Zalturi was a group of diseases that were bent on wiping out another subhuman species, Suris. A Suri was a person who attracted dead souls when they were born. The souls, unable to move on to wherever they went when they died, used the Suri as a host body. The soul's mind lived in the host, experiencing life as though it were a movie, and once the Suri died, the souls that had been trapped inside went with it. If the Zalturi had been after this girl, then she had to be a Suri. "You don't have multiple personality disorder, do you?" Plague asked. Nasky froze like a deer in headlights. "I don't know." "Let me help you, then," Plague offered. "You may have MPD, but it's more than likely that you have something else." "Like what?" Nasky asked shakily. "I'll test it later," Plague murmured. "Get some rest." He turned and strode out of the room. If she was a Suri, which there was no certainty that she was until he tested it, Nasky would need to be put under protection. The Zalturi were relentless, and if finding that their mission to assassinate the young, naive Suri had failed, then they would surely send better fighters. "How is she?" The voice made Plague lift his head from the wooden floorboards and look at the dark brown-haired man that stood over a large binder filled with paper. Green eyes looked out from the dark bangs. "She's drinking," Plague told him. "Seems to be stomaching it fine. She told me the disease that went after her had blonde hair and green eyes." "That could be any number of diseases," Casanov sighed, looking down at the binder. It held information on every disease he knew about, their faces, names, which disease they were, and their location. "He said 'Long live the Zalturi' before he ran off." Casanov lifted his head. "Zalturi?" he asked. "Yep." Plague raised his eyebrows. "She might be a Suri. When I asked if she had MPD, she said, 'I don't know.'" "She's a Suri," Casanov nodded. Plague placed his hands on the table and leaned over the binder, peering at the page that Casanov was on. "Normally you would want to test it before you flaunted your answer around." "If she said 'I don't know,' then that means she went to the doctor," Casanov told him. "The doctor would have tested her and said she might have it. That's the only reason she would say 'I don't know.'" "I don't know if she's a pure Suri yet." Plague looked at him. "That we do need to test." "Do you think she'll freak out if we tell her we're diseases?" Casinov's eyebrows furrowed. "Not sure." Plague frowned slightly. "I don't even think she knew that her attacker was a disease. We need to get her tested as soon as possible." Well, Casanova sighed. I could get Foxpod to come over here and not Foxpod. Plague shook his head. He would terrify her. Owry? Casanova suggested. He doesn't know how to yet. I could do it. No, you haven't got your strength up. Last week was rough on you. Castano's lips pulled into a frown, and he subconsciously placed his hands over his stomach, where last week 4 bullets had been driven into his gut by a human who had recognized him as a disease. You wouldn't be able to make it, Plague told him. I'll do it. Castanal looked at him sternly. You remember what happened last time, Plague. I know, Plague shot back. I don't need reminding. Castanal sighed slowly. Don't push yourself. I won't, Plague scowled. He strode off back towards the girls' room. The last Suri he had found had turned out to be a cursed Suri, meaning that they had somehow attracted all evil souls. When Plague had begun testing, the souls inside had gripped his soul and tried to pull it out. He had been shaken for months and hadn't tested ever since. That, however, was years ago, and he would not allow Foxpod to come and test the girl. He would do it himself and no longer let what had happened bother him. Plague slipped into the girl's room. She was lying with her head resting against the pillows that sat her up slightly. The empty cup of water lay in her hands, and she stared blankly out the small window. Not much of a view, he told her. She turned her head to look at him. Just the wall of a building, she said sheepishly. Plague offered a slight smile and then frowned. Nasky stared at him for a moment. Is something wrong? She asked nervously. No, Plague shook his head. I'm sorry, I'm just distracted. We need to talk about what happened. Look, she fretted, I don't know what happened or why he did that, so... I know you don't, Plague interrupted. That's why I'm going to tell you. However, before I can, you need to trust me. Nasky looked up at him, her mouth slightly open. I have to do a test on you, Plague told her, and it's a very strange test. Not one that a doctor would give you. Well, I already got tested for MPD, Nasky trailed off. And? Plague asked. I have it. She swallowed hard as though it pained her to say it. The doctor was giving me weird looks when he left. Did you black out while you were there? Plague's eyes narrowed. Yes, Nasky squeaked. Plague took in a breath and held it. If everything was as it sounded, then this girl was more likely than not a pure Suri. The doctor had tested her, and it sounded like he had provoked one of the souls from showing themselves. He had given her a weird look because of the hair color and eye color changing. Still, he needed to test her to be sure. This isn't a test for MPD, Plague continued from his earlier conversation. It's different. What are you testing for? Nasky asked slowly. That's the strange part, Plague told her. I can't tell you what I'm testing for unless you test positive. Oh, Nasky frowned deeply. She seemed nervous and scared. Plague grimaced inwardly. He hated when females got like this. Do you have to? She asked. I mean, I don't know you or anything. It's important, he replied. It may have something to do with why you were attacked. Nasky looked down at her hands. It requires you to trust me. Plague forced his voice to soften, and not be afraid if something does happen. If you test positive, things may get confusing. More confusing than they already are? Nasky laughed weakly. Possibly. Nasky bit her lip, still staring down at her hands. Plague, Castanov poked his head in, glancing at Nasky. We have a problem. What is it? Plague asked him. There's someone at the front, Castanov told him, looking for a Nasky Videl. That's me, Nasky said quietly. Castanov glanced at her and offered her a smile. But we're handling it. They shouldn't be a problem. Do you know someone named Jeremy? No. Nasky looked at them, wide-eyed. Casanov frowned and glanced at Plague. I'll handle it. Plague shook his hair so part of his bangs fell over where his left eye should have been. Stay here with her. He brushed past Castanon and down the hall, trotting down the stairs and looking into the face of a red-haired, brown-eyed man. "Can I help you?" Plague asked. "Like I told your friend." The man nodded. "I'm looking for Nasky Vidal. She may have been injured and brought here." "What's your relation?" Plague's voice was emotionless. "I'm her uncle," the man replied. Plague acted immediately. His leg came up and kicked the man in the chest, knocking him onto the floor. The man stumbled to his feet slowly, smirking. "So, she is awake," he grinned. "I'm not much of a talker during fights," Plague snarled. He shot forward once more, his fist striking against the man's nose, chin, throat, and finally his gut. The man doubled over before he could even put his hands up. Plague pushed him onto his back with one foot, frowning. "They're not sending very good ones after her, are they?" Plague asked. "What are you supposed to be? Athlete's foot?" "Very funny," the man spat, rolling onto his side and struggling to his feet. He winced slightly as blood trickled down his nose. Plague ducked down and punched the man in the gut. The man doubled over, but not before grasping Plague's hair and yanking him over. Plague's forehead hit the wall, and for a moment he stood in a daze. The man's knee came up and dug into his stomach, knocking the breath out of him. Taking in a ragged breath, Plague's fist shot forward, landing the perfect hit against the man's ribs. The man let out a wail as the bone cracked beneath the force. The man dropped. Plague stood tall and looked down at him. "You should go now," Plague hissed. Moaning in pain, he slowly picked himself up. He clutched his ribs and stumbled outside. "Tell your precious Zalturi they can't have her," Plague snarled after him. He shut the door behind him, irritated. His stomach was aching now. Clenching his jaw, Plague trotted back up the stairs, where Casanova was sitting on the stool at the end of Nazki's bed. She seemed more calmed down and even cheerful. "Everything okay?" Casanova asked cautiously when Plague entered. "Fine." Plague pressed his lips into a thin line. Casanova recognized the look and returned one that Plague knew all too well. "What happened?" Plague just shook his head. Nasky looked up at Plague. "I'll do the test, the one you were talking about." "All right." Plague glanced at Casanova, who gave him a stern look before standing and leaving the room. Plague pushed the door closed and stood beside Nasky. "You'll need to sit up more." Nasky pushed herself up into a sitting position, letting out a slight groan as her stomach muscles felt the wound in her belly. The pain medicine Casanova had given her had definitely helped, but he had told her not to push it, or she might rip her stitches. "This'll be strange," Plague warned her. "Don't freak out, though." "Okay," Nasky whispered. Plague carefully pulled off his shirt, watching her reaction. She turned red as a tomato and started to stammer as she stared at the perfectly carved body before her. "Calm down," he murmured. She nodded, staring at him in alarm. "It's not what you think it is," he sighed. "Give me your hands." Nasky reached two trembling hands out and Plague took them. He pressed them to his chest, right over his heart. Nasky flushed redder, if possible. "Put your forehead on my collarbone." He leaned forward as she did what she was told. "No matter what happens, don't pull away." The second her forehead touched his collarbone, he felt the overwhelmingly chilly grip of a Suri's presence. The cold encased his body and made him tremble for a moment. Closing his eyes, he could feel the single soul that used Nasky's body as a vessel for death. Nasky let out a breath, turning pale as the red disease mark on Plague's chest appeared. Her eyes opened wide. Plague allowed his soul to stretch through the coldness in the air and reach into Nasky's. He saw one soul in her cradle so far, but more would come. He opened his eyes for a moment, now to check whether she was a pure Suri or not. He reached behind her and pushed her shirt down slightly, enough to see the white mark that had appeared in between her shoulder blades. She was a pure Suri. Plague pulled his soul back and let out a breath. He broke away from her, and their marks disappeared in seconds. "What just happened?" Nasky asked breathlessly. "Rest," he told her, pulling his shirt back on. "I'll explain everything to you later." Nasky slumped onto her back slowly. Plague stalked out of the room and out into the hallway, where Casanova stood waiting. "What's going on?" Casanova asked fiercely. "She's a pure," Plague told him. "We need to get her out of here and to the house." Casanova lowered his head and let out a breath. Their troubles were only just beginning.